Dear Diary, it is November 2006 and I have spent the past 7 hours and 13 days enlisted in the PlayStation 2 History Channel FPS Brigade. I had wanted to join the Infinity Ward Call of Duty Cavalry, but Mother slapped me in the back of the head and reminded me that I didn't have the right console for that. Water and nourishment is scant, and I've been living off of a steady supply of beef jerky and Mountain Dew, with no signs of malnutrition afflicting me yet aside from reckless bedwetting, sweating literal bullets, and finding myself going on extended rants about how the History Channel makes totally great first-person shooter games and how Jacob from Science Class should stop being a dick about how much better COD 2 and 3 is on his stupid Xbox. Also, I've noticed that I'm starting to sound a bit like Loveless from the major motion picture Wild Wild West, and I woke up with a funky mustache today. Truth be told, the accent strikes me as a bit offensive, but I can't seem to stop doing it.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
By the way, I noticed this cool thing on the Internet Explorer yesterday called montages, emo rock, and the musical theater group Stomp. That's all for now. I'm feeling like eating some beef jerky bits off of my mustache. Yours truly, Niche. XOXO.
Well, I do declare.
You know, I've been feeling really nostalgic lately. Maybe it's happenstance, maybe it's the time of the year. Hey, maybe it's a sign that I've finally peaked and I'm just gonna go down a gradual decline in my health and standards for the rest of my life. But yeah, regardless, I've been thinking about a lot of the games that I grew up playing and, interestingly enough, games related to those titles that I missed out on as a kid. Which is what brings me to these games, and the mistakes I made by playing them.
Between 2006 and 2008, the History Channel released a trilogy of games across a number of consoles that were designed to put you in the shoes of American soldiers fighting across famous battles that spanned the 19th and 20th century. These games, which are Civil War: A Nation Divided, Battle for the Pacific, and Civil War: Secret Missions, were a collection of first-person shooter military action games that came out during the genre's golden age on home consoles, a time in which every developer was trying their darndest to get in on a piece of the military action complex's pie. With the War on Terror in full effect and Americans in their first truly extended military conflict since the 70s, the first-person shooter genre perhaps not so coincidentally fully rose to prominence on home consoles with franchises like Halo, Killzone, the Tom Clancy games, and Medal of Honor, among others, becoming household names, alongside a series that I have to briefly cover in order to adequately contextualize the actual subject of this video: Call of Duty. Created by Infinity Ward, a developer that was made following the departure of 22 staff members from 2015 Inc., the team behind Medal of Honor Allied Assault, the first Call of Duty was released on PC to critical acclaim in 2003 and spawned a franchise that's gotten yearly entries with zero exceptions for the past 2 decades.
What? Regardless of how you feel about the franchise, that's really impressive.
Back in the mid to late 2000s through the mid 2010s, you simply couldn't escape Call of Duty's icy grip. It was everywhere, from standard mobile devices to the Nokia N-Gage, handhelds like the Nintendo DS and PSP, home consoles, and even got very obtrusively worked into an episode of NBC's The Office in a case of product placement that was as obvious as I am breathing, but still makes for a fairly enjoyable Season 3 B-plot.
Call of Duty.
Yup, Call of Duty was everywhere, and the unstoppable first-person shooter series led to an absolute glut of imitators and competition hitting the market. You had the tactically minded free-to-play army recruitment tool America's Army getting its first console entry, DICE's Battlefield series, which itself had also started off as a World War II shooter, being spun off into the delightful Bad Company games, and heaps upon heaps of other games that adopted at least some of the franchise's staples, like aiming down iron sights, having automatically replenishing health, and a perk system for its multiplayer. That's not to say that Call of Duty necessarily invented these things, but given the series' dominance at the time, it's a safe bet to assume that's where a lot of people got those ideas from.
As a person that was a high school freshman the year Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 came out back in 2009, I can personally attest for the fact that COD was just about all everyone was talking about for a couple of years there.
In the same way that some would say kids only want to play games like Fortnite or Minecraft these days, a statement that I definitely agree made me sound like a bit of a boomer and also coincided with my backcracking and my developing a weird affection for game shows. Call of Duty 4 through Black Ops 2 was, along with games like Halo 3 and Grand Theft Auto 4, my bread and butter during my final years in the American public school system.
And Activision, Call of Duty's publisher, knew they struck gold with the franchise because before they just had their developers whip up DLC for each of their games, they went as far as to have a game dev make an entire trilogy of Call of Duty clones.
And when I say it was fairly obvious that these games were intended to cash in on the success of Call of Duty and the genre as a whole, I really mean it. Over the course of 3 years, Activision had these games as developer Cauldron pump out a game a year within the same month as a mainline Call of Duty game. It was a shameless attempt to capitalize on people who were itching for more FPS action or parents who simply wouldn't have known any better than to pick these games up for their kids instead due to the History Channel license. The first game in this trilogy, Civil War: A Nation Divided, came out on November 7th for the PlayStation 2, Xbox 360, and PC, which is the same exact day that Treyarch put out Call of Duty 3 on all the same exact consoles aside from the Wii and PS3, which could technically play A Nation Divided via backwards compatibility since this was close enough to the launch of the hardware for its install base to only own backwards compatible units.
Oh, and I guess it also helps that the PS3 wouldn't come out in the US for another 10 days or so.
The second game, which coincidentally drops the whole Civil War angle in favor of giving us the World War II action that COD was known for, Battle for the Pacific, came out on December 4th, 2007, almost exactly a month after Infinity Ward put out Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare. Not only that, the game was even available on the Wii and PS3 and is technically two different titles, with the Xbox 360, PS3, and PC versions being Cauldron joints that are completely different from their Wii and PS2 iterations. And the final game, Civil War: Secret Missions, came out another year later on November 4th, 2008, exactly 1 week before Treyarch's Call of Duty World at War hit current-gen consoles, took everyone back to World War II again, and strangely enough, partially focused on the Pacific theater like Cauldron had in their previous game. Upon their release, these games were all ritualistically butchered by players and critics alike, who all called out their simple and junky AI, their repetitive gameplay, and most of all, their extremely short length, as each of these games were only about 3 to 4 hours long and can be beaten in about half the time it takes to play a normal Call of Duty campaign. In fact, Planet Xbox 360 gave this game an absolutely scathing review where they said that they couldn't recommend the first game, A Nation Divided, to first-person shooter fans, nor could they recommend it to diehard Civil War buffs, but that, quote, the only person they can recommend this game to is a sadomasochist because they'll enjoy the torture and unbearing pain that's this game. Similarly, IGN would say that the second game, Battle for the Pacific, wasn't necessarily atrocious, but rather that it brought very little to the table, adding that you should, quote, leave Battle for the Pacific on the shelf unless you're legally bound to own every World War II related video game ever made, and that they'd feel bad for you if this was the case. And yeah, these games aren't good, like, at all, but I honestly still found myself a bit transfixed with them and thought that they'd make for a fun review, because due to the wide variety of platforms they were unceremoniously tossed onto, as well as their existence well into the shadow of Activision's moneymaker of choice from the era, they're an interesting insight into what first-person shooters were like back in the mid to late 2000s, just as the genre was truly coming into its own. In a way, it's almost like getting to look back at embarrassing pictures of yourself going through puberty, or getting to read a diary belonging to yourself from when you were going through adolescence. It's an opportunity to experience that era through the lens of hindsight, peering into things with enough distance from the era to meditate over it, warts and all. Heck, it's literally getting to do that for me because I was only in middle school when these things first came out, and I even distinctly remember owning A Nation Divided back when it got released. That was before I even knew what Call of Duty or an Xbox 360 was, and in a way, it's almost poetic that I'll be completely avoiding the 7th gen versions of these games because it forces me to reflect on FPSs on the main platforms I had access to back when these games first came out. I had originally intended on covering those versions too, since a friend of mine was actually thinking of sending me her Xbox 360, but I wasn't able to get it in time for this video, and honestly, I'm grateful that I didn't need to play through them anyway, since they're basically just the PC version with controller support thrown in.
Anyway, welcome to A Positive Spin, a segment I like to do on my channel where I check out shovelware, bootleg, or just straight up bad games and try to look on the bright side of them. In today's video, I'll be checking out a trilogy of History Channel themed Call of Duty clones and trying to use them in order to gain a deeper appreciation and understanding of first-person shooters in the mid to late 2000s.
Cave paintings like these are one of the first examples of civilization on Earth. Don't worry, it gets better.
Because rather than just make fun of these games or use this video as an opportunity to shame Activision and call them sleazebags for publishing them, I think it'd be more interesting to try and understand where these games went wrong so that we can develop a tighter grasp of what better games in the genre have done right. Plus, given the bad publicity they've been getting in the news for the past few years, Activision seems to do just fine at outing themselves for being toxic sleazebags for much worse stuff than publishing some bad History Channel games anyway.
And I feel I should mention that I'll only be talking about the single player in each of these games because, with the exception of Battle for the Pacific's HD version, they're all only single player games to begin with. But either way, that doesn't really stop them from being Call of Duty clones, as will soon become abundantly clear to you once we start the video proper.
Before we continue though, a quick question of the day. What's one of your favorite games that you've ever been gifted? Whether it was a birthday gift, a holiday present, or heck, even just a game you gifted yourself after a long day at work, what's a game that's extra sentimental to you, and if you want to share it, what's the story behind it? Be sure to leave your answer to the question of the day over in the comments. I'd love to hear your answer. On top of that, feel free to subscribe to my channel if you like what you're seeing so far and want to see what I put out in the future. You could also subscribe to me on Patreon or do a one-off tip to my Buy Me a Coffee if you'd like to get some bonus goodies too. And with that out of the way, on with the video. Like I mentioned earlier, the History Channel's Civil War and Nation Divided, which is a total mouthful and has the hilariously convoluted and vaguely pharmaceutical sounding abbreviation, THCCWAND by the way, came out on the same exact day as Treyarch's Call of Duty 3, a game that itself has the reputation of being one of the franchise's less beloved mainline entries from the era. In it, you play as either a Union or Confederate soldier across 12 different missions that take place, as the title implies, during the American Civil War. Selecting a mission for either side leads to a brief Ken Burns Civil War documentary-style cutscene over archival artwork before showing you a loading screen that gives you some additional context for the upcoming level that's written in the first person, presumably for role-playing reasons. As far as the narrative goes, this is all pretty well thought out. The Burnsian presentation is a nice touch given the popularity of his documentary series on the war, and I also thought that the letters were cool too due to how they could be interpreted as a reference to how popular Civil War reenactments are. An activity that I don't personally understand the appeal of, but gives people the opportunity to act out events from America's bloodiest armed conflict fought on its own soil. However, I do have to bring up that this is straight out of Call of Duty 2 though, as that game gives you the choice of what army you'd like to fight for, though in Call of Duty 2 you're obviously playing as the Allied powers the entire time, and even allows you to read letters while watching levels load, which actually comes from the first Call of Duty 2. That's TOO, in case you were wondering what I meant there. However, that's all I could really say about the presentation that's positive because the rest of it is extremely rough.
For starters, let's listen to the aforementioned narration.
Lee now has 75,000 men on the heights overlooking the burning city.
Did you hear it? It's completely overblown and clipping, like to the point of sounding like a screamer on an Xbox Live private message from 2008.
As if that weren't enough, the actual in-game cutscenes feature the sort of misguided vocal performances that are reminiscent of the sort of ones you'd find in games released nearly a decade earlier. The dialogue feels stilted, the performances are over the top and theatrical, but they're also not over the top and theatrical in the fun Command and Conquer sort of way.
Space!
Also, and I really wish I was joking, one of the soldiers in this game straight up sounds like Barney from The Simpsons. As if that weren't enough, the game doesn't have music. Like, at all. Its menus have music, but the game itself is completely devoid of any fanfare whatsoever, which is a huge shame because music can do so much for a game. Without it, the sound design just feels limp and lifeless, forcing you to contemplate that all too familiar and sobering sadness that comes over you when you're playing something that you don't like. Now granted, Call of Duty 1 and 2 also have this problem to some degree, but it's much less of a big deal in those games due to how much more intense the action is to begin with. At that point, the gunfire and explosions surrounding you is the music, and plus, Call of Duty 2 does sprinkle in music from time to time. And then there's the gameplay, which is also pretty rough. Now, don't get me wrong, I wasn't expecting much from this game, especially since it was on the PlayStation 2 and because controlling FPSs was still largely far from perfect on it, but A Nation Divided totally airballs it. The controls themselves are largely fine, if not a little strange thanks to mapping reloading to pressing down on the right analog stick, but it's the aiming that really gets me. The analog aiming has a horrendously large dead zone on it that basically makes precision a no-go. It's actually a pretty big problem too, as trying to aim at your enemies in the PS2 game is basically all but guaranteed to result in you wasting ammo and getting stuck going through a painful reloading animation because, given the time period this game takes place in, you'll be stuck using a lot of slow-firing rifles and muskets. And like, that isn't an indictment of weapons of the era either, as I usually think using stuff like semi-automatic or bolt-action rifles in Call of Duty games is actually more fun than just using machine guns. It's just that this doesn't do the game any favors. Granted, you do also get access to pistols and melee weapons, with the pistols being the best weapons in the game by far due to their larger clip size and fire rate coupled with their reloading speed, but you're still gonna spend as much, if not more time reloading than you do shooting. There is one silver lining to this game's aiming though, if you can consider it one. The developers over at Cauldron clearly knew that the aiming was an absolute slog in this game because, to compensate for it, they added in heaps of aim assist to help you hit your mark. I know aim assist can be a bit controversial due to how many perceive it as sorta cheating, but it's always been a necessary evil for shooters that use controllers due to how hard it would be to aim precisely without giving us something like a mouse or, nowadays, gyro aiming.
Damn gyro.
You idiot. That is not a gyro.
I know, I tried. What do you want me to go to f***ing Greece?
However, while I do welcome it in console FPSs in general, and I also think it's helpful here, there's also no denying that the aim assist in this game is completely out of control and feels more like an aimbot than anything. The combat in this game can really be simplified as looking in the general vicinity of your enemy, aiming down your sights, and letting the game automatically snap your gun to their head for the easy headshot.
Oh yeah, and if you do happen to aim at an enemy that's standing still, which does happen quite often by the way, you're basically guaranteed to get that headshot every time.
It genuinely blows my mind how shameless the aim assist is in this thing. I know the standards for console aiming were still being developed, but even in other first and third person shooters from the era, aim assist was still comparatively fairly hidden. And even when it wasn't that hidden, the aim assist still felt somewhat earned because it complemented those games' respective aiming styles and was acknowledged via features like a lock-on button or offering free aim through a specific button. But not here! Heck, Call of Duty 3's aiming on its PS2 port, which also has some fairly obvious snapping to enemies in it, still feels more organic than this, and they literally came out on the same day. And it's not like COD 3 with some labor of love that didn't have a rushed development or anything either. In an interview during the lead up to Call of Duty World at War in 2008, it was revealed that the game was slapped together in 8 months and shoved onto 5 different platforms. Now, I do feel kinda bad comparing this game to COD 2 and 3 so much, but it's honestly hard not to on account of how much of its design was ripped directly from that franchise. And ironically, if there ever was a COD game to compare this thing to and consider it a somewhat fair fight, it's probably Call of Duty 3. That game has long been considered to be the black sheep of main games for the classic era of the franchise, and seeing as both games came out on the same day and all, honestly makes it look like the genuinely great game that it is. Either way, the combat essentially boils down to glorified shooting galleries where you're expected to wade your way through hordes of enemies in order to complete inane objectives that often boil down to just setting explosives up or getting to a particular location. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, I guess, but it is kind of funny on account of how this is also something Call of Duty 2's campaign loves to do a lot and how much this game already has in common with that one. Anyway, the level designs themselves are completely uninspired, and while there are a few impressive things I noticed, like destroyable trees during a Gatling gun section, or a couple of scenic moments that genuinely had some good color design to them, the vast majority of this game takes place in a mix of dull-looking fields, narrow forest paths, or straight-up trenches, with the gameplay that takes place within them all feeling more or less the same. Adding to the monotony is the fact that you can't pick up enemy weapons in this game, meaning that you'll be stuck with whatever weapons you start the level with. And while this really doesn't matter since all the weapons are fundamentally the same and you'll just want to stick to the one with the highest fire rate to begin with, it just makes things feel joyless. The weapon variety in this game just feels way too limited for its own good, austerity be damned, and it leaves you wishing for weapons you know the game won't give you.
Anything else?
Phased plasma rifle in the 40-watt range.
Hey, just what you see, pal.
It also doesn't help that the game has an antiquated health system that feels as old and tired as the era it takes place in. Despite being a Call of Duty clone, it actually has a more traditional health system like the one in Call of Duty 1, giving you a static health bar and forcing you to pick up health packs in order to stay alive. Though somewhat interestingly, you can actually recover a bit of your health in this game by staying out of enemy fire. This is made even worse by how your teammates are largely useless when they're by your side, as well as how you'll be spending most of your time in each of the game's levels without any allies beside you to begin with. Civil War and Nation Divided is, ironically, a really lonely game that doesn't make you feel like you're the part of any nation at all. Aside from any enemies that are firing at you and the sound of the poorly implemented and very obviously looping audio, the levels just feel empty and becoming of a Gilbert O'Sullivan ballad. The awful level designs and lack of atmosphere reached their zenith in the Union level Fort Fisher, which is a stage that I actively remembered hating back when I was in middle school. It's covered in tall grass that enemies are hidden behind, and it's absolute torture to get through because the Confederate soldiers you're supposed to be shooting can see and attack you from behind the grass without you being able to see them in the first place. And to make things worse, the game completely lacks checkpoints or a sprint button, meaning that you'll be slowly trudging through the stage and trying your hardest not to get sent back to the beginning of it. Moving on to visuals, A Nation Divided is ugly. I mean, that's really the extent of it. Textures look muddy, models look chunky, and the animation looks stiffer than a brick wall. Speaking of the game's presentation, you may have noticed that the footage I'm showing looks clean, like really clean, and that's because I'm playing the game on an emulator that upscales the resolution to 1080p. Why? Well, because the game looks awful when played back at its standard resolution on anything resembling a modern display. Don't get me wrong, while the game still looks horrible on original hardware that's hooked up to a CRT, it can look borderline unintelligible when played back on a modern HD screen due to the amount of work that the standard definition signal has to do to fill the screen. So, to ensure the highest clarity picture for everyone watching this, I decided to upscale this in Battle for the Pacific on the Wii to 1080p so that I could better showcase these games and all of their problems. And I realize this may be a bit controversial for some of you guys, so from the bottom of my heart, I'm genuinely sorry. But I am an authority on this matter, because I just said I am, so I'm also going to take the liberty of AI upscaling this low-resolution JPEG of the Mona Lisa, recoloring the opening beach scene from Saving Private Ryan to look like a Technicolor musical from the 1950s, think like Fred Astaire or whatever MGM was doing at the time, and because I can, I'm also gonna be yassifying my ugly face right about now. This is surprisingly itchy. Everything about this game just reeks of blandness. Going back to my opening comment for this chapter when I said that the presentation mirroring Ken Burns' Civil War doc was pretty cool, I left out the fact that none of the stuff shown in the cutscenes or documentary segments were particularly interesting. While interesting in theory, the reliance on old photos and such, followed by the slow as molasses loading screens that come after them, can totally put you to sleep in a way that's ironic given the fact that these scenes resemble the sort of dated history videos you might remember watching in grade school. But unlike those delightfully nostalgic documentaries, some of these segments aren't just boring but lack important historical context when it comes to discussing the South in the 1800s. Civil War and Nation Divided does the weird thing of omitting why the Confederacy was a thing to begin with, to the point of it defacing the entire Confederate army of their objectively bad morals and belief in what they were fighting for. In other words, the game doesn't address slavery, while simultaneously portraying the actions you take as a Confederate soldier as being heroic and positive for you and your fellow troops.
Yeah, that's just messed up, honestly.
To better understand why this is a strange decision on the part of the developers, let's take another look at Call of Duty. The basic appeal of World War II era Call of Duty single-player campaigns was that, in its broadest strokes, it came with a power fantasy of fighting the good fight. The games portrayed you as a member of the Allied powers, briefly reminds you that Nazis are bad because unfortunately we live in a world where we actually need to do that from time to time for some reason, and that you need to do your part to stop them. More so, it does this without stopping and becoming a history lesson about the horrors committed during the war. It's pretty open and shut good versus evil stuff, and it's effective at what it seeks to do, even if I think romanticizing the single bloodiest event committed in the history of man wasn't entirely necessary, and it does simplify things quite a bit.
Do you want to kill Nazis?
I don't want to kill anyone. I don't like bullies.
In other words, this works. But when you hold the Nation Divided up beside it, you can quickly see how the Civil War game has gone astray. Because while this game is technically historically accurate in the sense that it does portray the South both winning and losing battles, which, obviously happened, it also seems disingenuous to portray their victories as being positive while also sidestepping the ugly realities that are tied to them. By not contextualizing our actions in these stages as belonging to the bad guys and simultaneously rewarding us for doing them, it runs the risk of erasing, or straight up does erase, some pretty important historical context that, much like the aforementioned World War II stuff, probably seemed like it didn't need to be said, but still does for some reason.
Abraham Lincoln once said that if you're a racist, I will attack you with the North.
Going back to my good fight point from a few minutes ago, it makes these victories feel like they themselves are tied to a larger and more important good when they simply aren't, and it undercuts what little potential there was in the game to have some sort of thematic undercurrent and nuance. As for why it does this, it may either be out of negligence or oversight on the part of the non-American developers, or out of the pursuit of some sort of impartiality that's completely unearned by the game itself.
Because really, if you're trying to have an impartial conversation about the Civil War but ignore the fact that slavery was one of the main reasons that it happened, you've already failed.
If you read South Carolina's Articles of Secession, the first state to secede, the birthplace of secession, they do not mention states' rights. They mention slavery. It is much more complicated than that, but essentially the reason why we murdered each other. More than 2% of our population, 750,000 Americans died. That's more than all the wars from the revolution through Afghanistan combined, was over, essentially, the issue of slavery.
It implies that you're glossing over the moral bankruptcy of owning another human being just so that you could unjustly level the playing field. And at the end of the day, it's a bad look for the game, it's a bad look for the History Channel, and it's most certainly a bad look for Activision, among many others. Oh my god, guys!
And yes, while the utter lack of detail and grace on display with its narrative doesn't really matter when it comes to playing the game itself, it's still pretty weak on the part of a nation divided. It conveniently handwaves away why the nation was divided in the first place and turns it into less of a game where the History Channel takes you on a journey through what was somehow only one of the most divisive times in American history, and more into a game about shooting the people wearing a different uniform than you because they're committing a huge fashion oopsie.
Oopsie whoopsie, we did a you, Lucky.
Anyway, from top to bottom, the game just feels unfinished. While I can't say that I hated it, I also can't say that I felt particularly much towards it either. And since it's often been said that the opposite of love isn't hate, but rather indifference, that feels about right, I guess. Its moment-to-moment gameplay isn't unbearable or anything, just a little dull and very reminiscent of the first Call of Duty in a lot of ways. And even though that sounds like it would be a good thing, you do have to remember that the first COD was 3 years old by the time this game came out, and that a lot of its design had already been evolved and refined by its sequels.
That being said, with this first game out of the way, I'm actually kind of excited to see where its sequels go. I mean, the bar was so low with this first one that it could only get better from here, right? Right? Plus, the next game I'm going to be playing is on the Wii, so it'll at least have the benefit of motion controls, which should make for a pretty fun time.
Released in 2007 for the Wii, the History Channel Battle for the Pacific takes place during the Pacific theater of World War II and has you play as an American soldier doing battle with the Imperial Japanese Army. Interestingly, this means that the game coincidentally focuses on the same exact part of the war that the next year's Call of Duty World at War would also partially take place in. Additionally, it came out almost exactly a month after the first Modern Warfare game brought the franchise to the current day and is actually two completely different games depending on what platform you're playing on. HD consoles and personal computers got a game that was developed by the same team that brought us the first Civil War game, Cauldron, while the PS2 and Wii got an entirely different title that was handled by Funlabs Romania SRL, a company that Wikipedia tells me was responsible for a ton of Cabela games that also runs on the same engine as this one. And while I'll briefly touch on the PC version of the game at the end of this chapter, what I'm really here to do is cover that Wii game. In 2006, Nintendo put out the Wii. It was a fun little box that had a neat gimmick that made gamers around the world learn a little French and gave strapping on a whole new meaning. And with it came the introduction of my favorite innovation to controlling shooters on console, motion aiming. Thanks to its built-in IR sensor, the Wii mode allows players to aim far more accurately than you ever could before. It was a genuinely great innovation for the genre because it gave console players a means of precise control over their weapons that was usually reserved for PC players and is continued to this day thanks to its development into gyro aiming. And it's also the main reason why I was genuinely excited to play this game in the first place. Because even if we ended up getting another game that was as poorly thought out as A Nation Divided was, the added benefit of motion controls would have made this at least a bit more fun to play. I was so wrong. While Battle for the Pacific does feature several improvements over its predecessor, like checkpoints, a health system that's basically the one from Call of Duty but still has a health bar for some reason, and a story that's presented in the first person and takes place from the perspective of a single protagonist fighting in the war, it also somehow manages to screw up the single most important thing in a first-person shooter. You know, the shooting. While the basic IR aiming works fine enough, aside from some occasional hitches that I couldn't reproduce in any of the other games I tested while prepping for this video, aiming down your sights to play this game is an active hindrance on your accuracy. I don't know what went horrifically wrong during this game's development, but it's obvious that something must have happened because aiming down your sights all but locks your aim in place. I mean, you can technically adjust where you're pointing, but it'll require a mind-boggling amount of movement on your part to incite even the smallest bit of sway. In the last chapter, I mentioned how aiming down your iron sights was less than ideal due to a strangely high dead zone on the right analog stick whenever you do so. And it seems like this issue would somehow manage to carry itself over to the second game despite its main control method lacking analog aiming for most of its weapons. Because of this, it's completely inadvisable to aim down your sights, especially because you can effectively hit enemies from across the map while shooting from the hip anyway. Seriously, there were moments in this game when I was straight up able to snipe enemies with a handgun in a way that would have made N64 GoldenEye Brosnan proud. And there's genuinely no reason to use any of the game's other weapons over the pistol if you have ammo for it too. Most of them take 2 to 3 hits to kill enemies to begin with, and even though the game does feature automatic weapons and they can be helpful, the pistol's combination of accuracy, decent clip size, and an acceptable fire rate makes it a no-brainer. Yep, nothing beats the classics. However, for what it's worth, each of the game's other weapons are improvements over what was found in A Nation Divided. This is due to the game taking place in the 1940s, which was a time in which the developers had a wider variety of weapon types to pull from, and in another improvement, you can actually pick up other people's weapons in this game. However, for whatever reason, your weapon pickups can only be swapped out by category, meaning that picking up a submachine gun or rifle automatically overwrites your primary weapon, picking up an enemy katana overwrites your knife, etc. This is actually really similar to the way weapons worked in Call of Duty 1, where you could carry a primary, a submachine gun, a pistol, and grenades at once. Heck, this game also likes to treat grenades as its own weapon type that you'll need to pull out, just like in that first Call of Duty. It's not a big deal, but it's definitely a weird deviation from how most FPSs handled things, even at the time. Either way, it's a huge shame that all these guns feel more or less the same when you're firing them, and that the stationary ones you'll have access to have absolutely broken controls. Because despite the fact that aiming down your sights is an infuriatingly useless endeavor, it at least implemented some sort of motion aiming. And that unbelievably can't be said for the mounted weapons in Battle for the Pacific, because they default to using the nunchuck's analog stick to aim. You know, you really think that a company that's known for making hunting sims would understand the fact that when I'm playing a game on a console known for its motion controls, I actually want to use motion controls to aim in their video games. But no, here we are. And also, you'd expect the History Channel and Activision to know better than to offload their games about American history to non-American companies that can't seem to do the American history justice. It's literally the selling point of the game. You're a company called the History Channel. Just make a game with some semblance of historical accuracy. Or hell, just go in the other direction and make a game about shooting aliens. That's like half of your programming anyway. Let me play a Pawn Stars game where I get so mad at being lowballed that I run in there, steal a revolver off the counter, and I start trying to threaten people, only to get gunned down in a giant battle with the police because I don't want to actually hurt people in a video game. The moral repercussions of that is it's too mind-bogglingly arresting, guys. I just can't handle it. Gonna need a minute. Additionally, if you decide that motion controls aren't for you and you absolutely refuse to play this thing on the PlayStation 2, you could also just use a classic controller in order to play this more traditionally. And just because they could, I suppose, they ended up mostly fixing the dead zones on the classic controller, leading to it actually being more accurate than the Wiimote. Even though playing through Battle of the Pacific this way is definitely an improvement, aside from some iffy button mappings that can't be changed from the menu, it also happens to feel a bit like cheating on account of the hardware that the game is running on. It's cool from an accessibility point of view, but it still kinda reeks of knowing that the main control method sucked and trying to make up for it by giving us a more traditional input device. Also, it doesn't have GameCube controller support, so what the hell? While I do find it admirable that the game tries to be more ambitious by throwing in more cutscenes, set pieces, and even including some music during the levels themselves, all of these things come with some pretty inexcusable baggage. For starters, the cutscenes look absolutely terrible and like something that belongs on the PlayStation 1 at points. They're low frame rate, they're compressed to hell, and their contents lack anything interesting enough to actually justify interrupting the gameplay. As for the set pieces, it shows a level of ambitiousness that the first game was mostly devoid of, but they're also exceedingly unfair due to how awful the controls are. Plus, they aren't that interesting in the first place, and more often than not lead to an unnecessary difficulty spike on account of the fact that you'll lose your ability to dodge enemy fire. This also isn't helped by the fact that the game's self-regenerating health system moves at a glacial pace. Oh, and in as early as the second level of the game, the missions you're given include some blatantly broken English too. It's just like, you're the History Channel, guys. Have some standards. Just some. And last, the game's music. There isn't that much that I could honestly say about it other than the fact that it's there and it's aggressively generic. Moving on though, let's talk about the level design. It's every bit as linear as the first game was, but now comes with the baggage of occasionally forcing you to replay a level that you've just beaten in reverse. If I'm counting right, it only happens twice in the campaign, but that really says it all and is all the proof needed to confirm that this game was almost definitely another rush job. And like, I know that reusing levels isn't automatically the sign of a bad game or anything. I mean, Halo 1 did that a ton, and that's still one of my favorite FPSs, but it goes to show that even if the guys over at Fun Labs had some good ideas for this game, they probably wouldn't have had the time to adequately execute on it. Plus, even without the recycled levels, the game is absolutely a buggy mess. For example, there's a section in 2 of the levels, which is one of the ones you have to play twice by the way, where there's just a straight up invisible wall blocking what should have been an open window. And while you'd think something like that would have been spotted in the QA process for this game, you'd be wrong because it's not a necessary area to visit during the levels, so I guess they just didn't check or didn't care. I mentioned that this game came out just a month after Call of Duty 4 hit the market, and even though the Wii didn't get COD 4 until 2 years later in 2009, comparing them's like night and day. Even if you compare this game to the Wii version of Call of Duty 3 from 2006 or 2008's World at War port, Battle for the Pacific fails in every regard imaginable, aside from supporting the classic controller. Even upscaled to 1080p, there's so many moments in this game when you'll straight up be unable to see where you're being shot from, even with the game's improved radar basically telling you what direction to look in. Making things worse is the fact that once they're far enough away from you, enemy guns don't even get muzzle flashes anymore, making it all but impossible to track where they may be hiding without just relying on your target reticle to turn red while you slowly scan your surroundings. The best thing that this game could have realistically had going for it was the fact that, had it even remotely nailed the motion controls, it would have made for an interesting sideshow attraction. It doesn't really seem like it has the potential to have ever been good, but I mean, for 10 to 20 bucks, this would have been perfectly fine, I guess. But as is, it's nothing more than a reminder that the Wii Call of Duty installments were actually pretty good and worth checking out if you're ever in the mood for some old school motion aiming fun. As for the PC, and by proxy, the Xbox 360 and PS3 versions, while I do think that they're by far the better versions of the game, it's also one of the dullest things that I've played in a while.
God!
I'm gonna keep this review as short and sweet as possible since the next chapter delves into the third game in the trilogy and focuses on the PC version of it specifically, but Battle for the Pacific's then next-gen release is an extremely short jaunt through several locales and battles not represented in the last-gen game. And even though its levels are technically better designed than, much more vibrantly rendered than, and the music is generally better than what we got on the Wii, this game's big problem is that it's really undercooked, to the point of the game literally being 2 hours long, even when accounting for it cutting corners to get to that length by forcing you to backtrack through most of its levels. Its music also even randomly cuts out without any warning whatsoever.
You gotta hear this one song, it'll change your life, I swear.
I like it.
It feels more like a hack of Cauldron's first Civil War game that fixes a couple of the gripes I had with it without ever going far enough to really be its own thing. It's the better version of Battle for the Pacific, but that also isn't really saying much. Also, it actually shares a mission with Treyarch's Call of Duty World at War from just a year later, and I'll leave it up to you to decide which game did it better.
Whoa, what is this? What the f*** is this?
So yeah, that's the History Channel, Battle for the Pacific on the Wii and PC. When I started a positive spin on my channel, I did it because I thought that YouTube had more than enough angry reviews on it, and that while I do enjoy an angry or pessimistic review of something terrible as much as the next guy, that it would be interesting to try my best to go in the opposite direction with some of my videos. And I've failed with that today, because even though I entered this game with extraordinarily low expectations, I still managed to find myself completely exasperated by the sheer disaster that Battle for the Pacific was. I expected to play a goofy, buggy, fun game that made me feel like Kermit the Frog playing Indiana Jones. But instead, it left me feeling like Kermit the Frog playing the late night TV circuit.
Ginger, no!
But hey, at least the game wasn't a thinly veiled piece of Confederate revisionism, am I right? That counts for something. Apparently. The bar is so low that the World War II History Channel game is getting points for not being Confederate revisionism. That's truly the timeline we live in. So that's Cool Beans McCoy. That's McCoy from Star Trek, but he's a coffee bean suddenly.
Alright, so going into this game, I really didn't know what to expect. For starters, Cauldron was back to handling every version of the game, and had even taken it back to the Civil War with an emphasis on what they called secret. Additionally, they were skipping out on the Wii this time around and were only making HD versions with a PS2 port thrown in for good measure too. However, given the past 2 games I played, I expected another relatively painful slog.
Which is what makes the Activision-published Cauldron game, Disney Marvel's The History Channel's Captain America Civil War, The Avengers, Secret Wars, Secret Missions, all the more surprising because it's actually a pretty fun game.
THCCWSM, which sounds a bit like a kink, isn't great or anything, but especially after Battle for the Pacific on the Wii, it really surprised me with how competent it felt. In fact, Secret Missions was so competent that it made me want to pick up a boxed copy of the first game on PC to see if it was any good too. Well, that, and I felt like honoring my childhood nostalgia for the PS2 version by keeping it on my shelf. And, well, A Nation Divided's PC version is just a prettier port of the PS2 game with mouse support and some weird compatibility issues that had the game running at 9 frames per second and couldn't be reproduced on any of the other PC games I played today.
Oh, and just because they could, I suppose, you can actually pick up enemy weapons in this version of the game. Because apparently the PS2 couldn't handle doing this.
Civil War Secret Missions takes the would-be series back to its roots and came out just a week before Call of Duty World at War did, a game that in and of itself was Treyarch's attempt to bring COD back to its roots too, and is coincidentally actually my favorite installment in the series, with Call of Duty 2 just barely behind it after I played a bunch of it while capping footage for this video. In it, you take a Confederate or Union soldier through several more of the war's most famous battles, with some of them being led by well-known generals from the era such as Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and Ulysses S. Grant. Also, according to the game's Wikipedia entry, you play as a Confederate cavalry that was known as Mosby's Rangers, which is something that I didn't find particularly interesting, but felt inclined to bring up anyway so that I could throw in a How I Met Your Mother reference.
Mosby boys!
We agreed you wouldn't do that anymore.
At any rate, the names attached to these missions, coupled with how straight up bombastic the missions themselves are, really makes me wonder what was so secretive about them. As far as I'm concerned, the biggest difference between this game and the first one is that these stages take place in a lot more urban areas than they did the first time around. Because of this, the stages are a bit more compact and linear than they were previously, although at the same time, it's not like A Nation Divided's levels weren't extremely linear themselves and unfold in a much more compartmentalized fashion. Basically, you'll enter a small area, get attacked by enemies, and need to fight your way out of that arena in order to move on to the next one or to complete some arbitrary objective. It's simple, but clean in its execution due to how it puts you in the thick of the action with little need for build-up. When it comes to secret missions, especially on the PC, it's also a much cleaner experience than any of the other games in the series ever came close to providing, so long as you take the time to fix the game's physics. Oh yeah, that's a huge thing that I should probably get into for a sec. Each of the PC games in the series have their physics mapped to the frame rate, and while stuff like this isn't entirely unheard of, I mean Star Fox on the SNES had the frame rate control the speed of the game itself, it can prove to be a bit problematic when it comes to playing these games on modern hardware. Without using an external tool to cap these games at 60 frames per second, you'll basically be stuck with an unplayable heap of garbage. The game itself will run just fine, mind you, but your bullets will literally phase out of existence the second they leave your gun, and you'll be unable to kill anybody, which I'm told can be an itty-bitty problem in a first-person shooter.
Whoa, careful there, Annie Oakley.
I don't have to be careful, I got a gun.
Once you get that fixed and out of the way though, this is actually fairly alright. For starters, the gameplay actually feels moderately fleshed out this time and like a natural iteration on what came before it. Some of the game's improvements include being able to lean to the left and right from behind cover, a feature that, by the way, even made its way onto the PS2, PS3, and Xbox 360 versions of the game, and while it's not that useful, it is a nice touch and is something that PC Call of Duty games also offer. Additionally, there's a perk system in its single player that allows you to do stuff like have extra health or make you stronger, and it generally encourages a bit of replay value. It would have been really cool to see Cauldron try and take this a step further by adding modifiers to the game that could have acted like the skulls in a Halo game, but either way, this is actually pretty nice. Weapon variety is also a bit better than it was in the first game since you can pick up enemy firearms, the game still has checkpoints, and because we're on PC, even the aiming feels more skill-based. If I had to nitpick though, I'd probably complain about how insane the sensitivity is on each of the History Channel PC games in general though. Seriously, I basically had to lower it as much as I could in the settings in order to get to a place where it felt somewhat natural, and even then, it was still a bit too jittery for my liking. Additionally, while there are more weapons in the game this time around, and they do generally feel better and more varied than they did previously, the pistols really got the short end of the stick in this one due to how piss poor Cauldron made their range. If an enemy happens to get more than a dozen or so paces from you, you basically won't be able to hit them with your pistol, and this results in situations where you could end up walking towards the enemy slowly while you try and unload sweet leaden justice on their ass.
God damn it, dude!
Also, much like in Battle for the Pacific on the Wii, aiming down your iron sights isn't really necessary across any of these PC games. As far as the gameplay goes though, that's really it. It's genuinely more of the same action we've seen in the other games, albeit in a more urban setting and with a boring cannon level that takes place on a boat that tries really hard to be the AC-130 level from Call of Duty 4. And while the extra hardware genuinely did make this a better game than any of the other History Channel COD clones, I especially liked using grenades to watch its glorious Havoc physics ragdoll enemies all over the place, I can't say that it actually did enough to make this game stand out. Especially because despite the many improvements on display here and the fact that it probably recycled a ton of assets to make sure it got them, it still feels really unfinished and like corners were cut to get it out the door at Activision's behest. While it does have more music than what was found in Battle for the Pacific, there are still just too many moments in the game that don't have any music at all, namely during the Union missions, which now take up the back half of the game. Similarly, while the level designs are generally better and even a bit more memorable than they were in the other games, parts of them also feel pretty copied and pasted and can suffer from some unfair difficulty spikes. And last, even though this game is a better, more refined, and generally greater game than its peers, it still manages to feel like the least unique and ambitious one of the bunch aside from Battle for the Pacific's HD release. With the other games, you could tell that Cauldron and Fun Labs were both well over their heads with what they were trying to accomplish and the time allotted to them to do it. Because of this, the games failed harder than Secret Missions did at nearly every turn, but it made for an interesting failure. But here, the game's just playing it safe, so while it is a better and more fun game, it's also less interesting, and personally, I'd rather something fail spectacularly than just be dull.
Still, if I had to recommend any of these games to you though, I would probably go with Civil War Secret Missions. Truth be told, if I could just recommend that you play literally any Call of Duty over it though, I'd just say to do that. While Secret Missions is a bit on the generic side, it at least got close to being a genuinely great game. Had Cauldron had a bit more time to spruce up the gameplay, maybe flesh out the story a bit more and say the S word because, yep, this one doesn't say it either, you actually would have had a fairly memorable game on your hands, I think. And as an added bonus, had this come out at the same time as, say, Call of Duty 2, you would have actually had two games with fairly comparable quality. Call of Duty 2 would have definitely been the better game of the two, but you wouldn't have felt bad if you also picked up Secret Missions. As is though, Secret Missions is just a bit mediocre, I guess. It's decent, but mediocre. It's medium ochre.
Looking back at each of these History Channel games, one thing that stands out to me is how they genuinely got better with each main iteration, aside from Battle for the Pacific on the Wii. However, while these games wear their Call of Duty influence on their sleeve, it's also pretty obvious that they were a long call from ever being mistaken for them. They're just too buggy and reflective of a series experiencing the growing pains of the genre to leave much of a lasting impact on anyone who's played them. Even though the last of these games came out in 2008, meaning that it came out after Halo 3 and Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare elevated the quality of the genre in the eyes of a lot of players, the stylings of the console first-person shooter were still not entirely homogenized. And while some of the titles from the era that haven't aged entirely well in terms of their controls include absolute bangers like Fallout 3, Call of Juarez Gunslinger, and the original BioShock to name a few, these History Channel games reflect the other side of that coin, the side that's been left face down in some figurative mud for approximately 15 years.
So, can I recommend any of these games off the premise that they're an interesting look into the way first-person shooters used to be? No, but I am glad that I played through each of them anyway, with exception to Battle for the Pacific on the Wii and PS2.
At the beginning of this video, I mentioned that I grew up with A Nation Divided, and I decided to omit the fact that I actually remember enjoying the game quite a bit at the time. Seeing as my experience with the game predates my experience with the Call of Duty series, another series I hold somewhat near and dear to my heart, I literally didn't know any better when it came to playing FPSs on home consoles. Plus, at the time I got the game, my friends and I had just finished studying the Civil War in middle school history class, so the timing of the game's release couldn't have been any better, especially since history was my favorite subject through most of my time in school growing up before it got replaced by English sometime in high school. So for me, playing through these games was a surreal experience because it allowed me to recall and reminisce about how much fun my friends and I had talking about A Nation Divided, and it also allowed me to learn that it actually got a few sequels. And even though these games aren't good and don't have much going for them, the weird rabbit hole that they brought me down for this video was, in my opinion, kinda wonderful.
Even though I still consider myself something of a history buff, I honestly fell out of studying it on my own time once I graduated from high school. Which is just the way that some things go, you know? Like, once you're no longer regularly exposed to something because you have to be, you just sort of outgrow it. But the interesting thing is that through playing these games, I actually found myself wanting to get back into history, to the point where I may actually go check out some nonfiction books at my local library, check out some documentaries about famous historical topics, or even take an online history course during the holidays or something.
And because of that, it's hard for me not to appreciate these games because by being as bland and outright dull as they were, they at least left me hankering for a bit more of the real deal. And the same could probably be said about my relationship with Call of Duty games too, because I stopped playing them regularly after graduating from high school in 2013. Heck, playing a couple of the older ones to capture footage for this video reminded me of just how fun they could be. I know Call of Duty is considered something of a dude bro game series, and even though I can definitely see why it has that reputation, I genuinely think that it's got some really great titles to its name. And now, I honestly might go out of my way to experience some of them again, or in the case of some of the PS2 era spin-offs like Call of Duty 2 Big Red One or Call of Duty World at War Final Fronts, play through them for the first time.
Anyway, that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and that if you did, you feel free to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, answer to the question of the day, or just share it with your friends that may also enjoy it. On top of that, if you want to support the channel via donation or subscription, you can via my Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon, and you can also check me out on social media. The links are all in the description, they're also in the pinned comment, and they're also on this nifty lower third that's here. I feel like I'm doing the robot right now. Besides that, if you want, you can check out my movie and TV podcast, Media Obscura. It's a show hosted by myself, along with my girlfriend Sierra and my best friend Raekwon, where we talk about old and obscure movies and TV shows. It's a pretty laid back thing. It's usually just banter, comedic bits, making Raekwon laugh while Sierra just rolls her eyes at me. It's good stuff. If you like podcasts, check it out. If you don't, cool beans McCoy to you, sir. So yeah, bye.